So in the industrialized era, we just got these mega cities that are absolutely dependent upon supply chains that stretch around the world. But that also means their demographic collapse is the fastest in the world. So Korea and China are by far the two that are furthest along. And the only way a country that has more people in their 60s and 50s and 40s than their 30s, 20s, and 10s is by exporting. So they absolutely have to remain integrated. And if something happens to that integration, they don't have an economic model. The problem that we're seeing in Japan and Korea, and to a far lesser degree Taiwan right now, is it's not just that they have more people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's that the bulk of them are now on the very urge of retirement. And so they're not going to be able to maintain the productive system either. This all breaks this decade. That's when all of these countries age into mass obsolescence. So we have already seen in China the fastest increases in wages over the last 22 years of any country in any era in all of history. There is no longer a manufacturing subsector in China that can't be done cheaper in North America. The only reason we still think of China as a manufacturing hub is because of the sunk cost of the industrial plant, and that's not insignificant. We can't replace that overnight. But every time something relocates from China, it has a better supply chain that's shorter, that's cheaper, that's closer to the end consumer and higher quality. So there's nothing left for the Chinese to excel at, and they're facing the demographic bomb at the same time.
You know, as the Cold War was coming to an end, you saw people starting to say like, okay, our next big great power rival is going to be Japan. So like there's this like long-standing history of the United States basically, I don't want to say overly concerned, but being concerned about the next great rival. You seem to be implying that China is basically the equivalent of Japan in terms of like the US being precarious. They're taking our industrial base, but it turned out the 1990s happened and who's talking about Japan as our great rival anymore?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. It's a very familiar story in the United States that if we don't have somebody that we're stressed about, we start stressing about each other. And we all have seen in recent years how much fun that is. But it's part of our geography. When the United States was settled for the first 150 years, it was just expanding into some of the best farmland in the world with the best navigable waterways in the world. So everything was just easier and it got better every year for 150 years. We don't have a cultural framework built into our identity of threats. We expect everything to get noticeably better constantly. And so when it doesn't, we kind of lose our shit. 9/11 is a great example. Obviously, it was a tragedy, 3,000 dead, but as a side effect of our military interventions in the Middle East, we put the sharp end of American power on either side of every major trade and energy artery on the planet. Sputnik, of course, is the classic one. I mean, it was a beeping aluminum grapefruit, but we ripped up our entire educational and scientific system and coasted on the benefits of that revolution for 60 years. We tend to overreact, but it also means we overreact in our fixing of what we perceive the problem to be. And that tends to define global affairs for decades at a time.
So if China then, what our current approach to China is, and what would your analytical ideal reaction be?
We've got three things that are going on that honestly were bipartisan, both Trump and Biden. And I know that's like, don't say that too loud. But they, in terms of foreign policy and especially foreign economic policy, they are almost identical. Number one, we will never end the tariff system that we have against the Chinese. That is populist more than it is nationalist, more than it is economic, but it still has the same effect. So China is no longer a trusted partner. Number two, the United States is changing its military disposition. And it's not so much that we're moving forces to Asia, it's that we're moving forces away from the position where they could actually support Chinese trade. Now, I've always been of the feeling that when your country bases its existence on the Americans' willingness to bleed and die to protect your ability to get energy and food and challenge the Americans, that you have a problem with your national thinking. But we're seeing that all break apart right now, and the Russian war is the first phase of that. Third, there's a concern that China's not going to last long enough to be a full boogeyman. The demographic collapse there is so far advanced, and the Chinese are starting to release bits and pieces of their 2020 census, which suggests that they've overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, all of whom would have been born after 1980, and most of whom would have been women, which suggests that the Chinese population will shrink by half by just 2050. And if that proves true, China doesn't survive this decade. We'll have to find somebody else to freak about.
I think it was in Foreign Policy or maybe The Atlantic, which is that if we accept this analysis and we know that China has peaked, and Xi can read a demographic table with the actual data that they have, which is probably even worse than what they put out, then isn't now, like today, the most logical time in order to take Taiwan and in order to fulfill the maximalist agenda of the CCP?
I can see the logic of that, because if it's a purely nationalist question, having something to rally around certainly would help the CCP survive what is going to be a traumatic deindustrialization process. I mean, you can't lose half the population of your country and not have a political challenge. I mean, that'd be kind of silly. And so before the Ukraine war, I was thinking kind of a 1 in 3 chance that this was going to happen. I've reevaluated that. The Ukraine war has been kind of a testing ground for Chinese theories on how the world works. And the Chinese have always looked to the Russians as an example, not necessarily to follow, but something to learn from. So when the Soviet system collapsed, they're like, okay, we are not going to lose do some sort of perestroika. We're going to keep the lockdown. And because of that, China still exists today. But the assumptions that China has made have all been proven false. So the idea was that the war would be quick. And in Ukraine, that's clearly not going to be the case. And Taiwan's been preparing for their war with the Chinese for 10 times as long as the Russians have been preparing for their war with the Ukrainians, not to mention that Taiwan has a moat. So the idea that this would be a quick and easy fight, that's gone away. The idea that no one would intervene militarily has been proven hilariously wrong. The idea that the world would just suck it up because Russia is an important country and everyone needs food and energy, that's been proven false. And if you take the sanctions that have been put against the Russians and you put them against the Chinese, oh, dear God, you would crash the system in less than a year. You would have famine in 6 months. The trains would stop running in 3. It would be a catastrophe. But I think what has really terrified Xi the most is the boycotts. The idea that like individual people can have an influence on large-scale corporate policy, that is so foreign to the CCP's experience. They don't even know how to process that. So every assumption they've made has been proven wrong in the first month of the war. And normally, this would be the part where you take your smart people and you put them in the back room with some pizza and some beer and have them come up with a plan B. But Xi's cult of personality is now so all-encompassing that he's killed all the smart people. So there's no one left. It's just Xi. It's just the ideology. It's just the propaganda. And China is slamming its head into the wall over and over and over until something cracks. And we're seeing cracks throughout the entire system today. Their mismanagement of COVID is just one example.